You trust your eyes. You trust your memories. You trust that what you see, hear, and feel is real. But what if every moment of your life is being quietly edited, cut, rearranged, even rewritten by the very organ you rely on for truth? Not in some distant future, not in science fiction, but right now, inside your own head. Because history, real documented history, suggests something unsettling. Humans have never experienced reality as it truly is, and once you see the evidence, you can't unsee it. Before we step deeper into this strange journey, take a second to support the channel. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and in the comments, tell me where you're watching from or what you do for a living. It's always fascinating to see who's on the other side of the screen, because by the end of this video, you might start wondering how much of that identity is truly yours. Long before cities rose from stone, before written language carved thoughts into permanence, before the idea of truth had rules, there were humans standing beneath vast, silent skies, trying to make sense of a world that didn't yet make sense of them. Imagine the darkness of prehistoric nights. No artificial light, no glowing screens, just a sky so intensely filled with stars that it almost felt alive. For early humans, this wasn't simply space. It was something watching back, something present, something intentional. And already, something subtle was happening inside their minds. Their brains were not passive observers of this world. They were active interpreters, builders, editors. Every shadow flickering at the edge of a fire wasn't just a shadow. It could be a predator, or a spirit, or a warning. And the brain, wired for survival, didn't wait for proof. It filled in the gaps instantly. Because in that world, hesitation meant death. But here's where it becomes unsettling. The brain didn't just interpret reality, it began to invent parts of it. Early cave paintings, found in places like Lascaux Caves and Chauvet Cave, show animals not just as they were, but as they were experienced. Massive, almost supernatural figures, layered on top of each other, sometimes with extra limbs or distorted proportions. These weren't mistakes, they were perceptions. When ancient humans painted a bison with multiple legs, they weren't imagining fantasy. They were trying to capture motion, fear, memory, and presence all at once. Their brain wasn't showing them a frozen photographic image. It was blending moments together, editing time itself into a single frame. Already, reality wasn't stable. It was fluid. And then there were the rituals. Deep inside caves, far from sunlight, archaeologists have found evidence of ceremonies, strange arrangements of bones, pigments, and markings that suggest something far beyond simple survival. These spaces weren't just shelters, they were portals of perception. Many researchers now believe that early humans entered altered states of consciousness during these rituals. Through rhythmic drumming, dancing, or even natural substances, their brains shifted into modes where the boundaries of reality began to dissolve. In those moments, they didn't just believe in spirits, they saw them. Patterns on cave walls could begin to move, shadows could take form. The mind, deprived of normal sensory input, would begin to generate its own imagery, vivid, convincing, and completely real to the person experiencing it. Think about that. The very first humans may have lived in a world where imagination and reality weren't separate things. They were the same stream, flowing together without a boundary. And if that's true, then what we call hallucination today may have once been a normal part of perception. But the editing didn't stop there. Even something as basic as color, the way we see red, blue, or green, is not an absolute truth. It's a construction. Early human languages didn't even have words for certain colors that we now take for granted. In some ancient cultures, what we call blue simply didn't exist as a distinct category. The sky wasn't blue, it was something else. So what does that mean? It means their brains were literally organizing reality differently. They weren't just seeing fewer colors, they were experiencing a different world. And then there's time. For us, time feels linear, past, present, future, moving like a straight line. But for early humans, time may have been something far more circular or even fragmented. Without clocks, without schedules, without written records, their sense of time was tied to cycles, day and night, seasons, life and death. Memory wasn't stored as a precise timeline, it was emotional, symbolic, shifting, which means when they recalled an event, they weren't replaying it like a video, they were reconstructing it.
Just like we do, but perhaps more freely. And here's the unsettling connection to you. Even now, your brain doesn't store memories as perfect recordings. Every time you remember something, your brain edits it slightly, adjusting details, changing emphasis, blending it with other experiences. The ancient human brain did the same thing, just without the constraints we've built over time. Which raises a quiet, uncomfortable question. Have we really become more accurate in how we see reality? Or have we just become more consistent in our illusions? Because consistency can feel like truth, but it isn't the same thing. As human societies grew, as language developed, as shared beliefs formed, something began to happen. Individual perceptions started to align. People began agreeing on what was real, not because it became objectively true, but because enough minds edited reality in similar ways. Reality became a consensus. But beneath that agreement, the same ancient mechanism remained. The brain still filled in gaps, still predicted, still filtered, still edited. Only now it did so more quietly, more convincingly, and perhaps more dangerously. Because when early humans saw spirits in the dark, they knew they were stepping into something mysterious, something unknown. But today, we believe we are seeing clearly. We believe our version of reality is stable, accurate, and true, which might be the greatest illusion of all. And as we move forward through history, something even stranger begins to emerge. There were entire civilizations where people didn't just interpret reality differently. They heard voices. They received commands. They experienced guidance from something they believed was beyond themselves. But what if those voices didn't come from gods? What if they came from the same place that edits your thoughts right now? The next chapter takes us into a world where reality didn't just surround humans, it spoke to them.
There was a time in human history when silence didn't exist the way it does now. Not true silence. Because for millions of people across ancient civilizations, the world was not just something to be seen or touched, it was something that spoke. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. Voices. Clear, directed, authoritative. And the people who heard them didn't question their origin. They didn't pause to analyze whether these voices were internal or external. To them, the source was obvious. The gods were speaking. In the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, rulers claimed their decisions were guided by divine instruction. Laws weren't simply written, they were revealed. The famous Code of Hammurabi was not presented as human reasoning, but as justice handed down from a higher authority. But something about this pattern feels unsettling, because the descriptions of these divine messages share striking similarities across cultures that had no contact with each other. In ancient Egypt, priests entered trance-like states, claiming to hear gods through ritual. In ancient Greece, oracles like the one at Oracle of Delphi would deliver prophecies in altered states of consciousness, their voices trembling, their words cryptic yet deeply influential. People traveled vast distances to hear these voices. Wars were decided because of them. Lives were shaped, kingdoms altered, all based on something that no one else could directly hear. But here's the deeper question. What if these voices were not coming from outside at all? What if they were generated by the brain itself, but experienced as something external? There is a theory, controversial but deeply fascinating, proposed by psychologist Julian Jaynes. He suggested that ancient humans may have operated with what he called a bicameral mind. In this state, the brain's two hemispheres didn't communicate the way ours do today. Instead, one part of the brain generated commands, auditory hallucinations, while the other part experienced them as external voices. In other words, people didn't think the way you think. They didn't have an internal monologue like yours. They didn't silently reason through choices. They heard instructions, and they obeyed. If this sounds impossible, consider something simple. Even today, under extreme stress or certain mental conditions, humans can experience auditory hallucinations that feel completely real, voices that command, warn, or guide. But we label these experiences as abnormalities. In ancient times, they may have been normal, or at least far more common, which means entire civilizations could have been built on a form of perception where the brain externalized its own thoughts. Imagine standing in a temple, surrounded by flickering firelight, the air thick with incense, rhythmic chanting echoing through stone walls, and suddenly you hear a voice. Not a vague thought, not a feeling, a voice. It tells you what to do. And everyone around you believes the same thing, that this is divine. Would you question it? Or would your brain accept it as reality, because that's how it has always worked? Because here's the deeper truth. Your brain doesn't show you reality as it is. It shows you what it expects. And if an entire culture expects gods to speak, the brain may find a way to make that expectation feel real. But something changed. Slowly, over centuries, the voices began to fade. Historical records suggest a shift, a transition where humans began relying less on heard commands and more on internal reasoning. The gods didn't disappear overnight, but their voices became less direct, less immediate. Instead of hearing, people began interpreting. Instead of obeying, they began questioning. It's almost as if the brain rewired itself. But why?
Some believe this change was triggered by increasing social complexity. As societies grew larger, as language evolved, as humans needed to navigate more nuanced decisions, the old system of external commands may have become inefficient. So the brain adapted. It internalized those voices. What was once heard became thought. And now, instead of a god telling you what to do, you have something quieter. Your inner voice, your reasoning, your sense of self. But here's the twist. That inner voice you trust so deeply, it might not be as different from those ancient gods as you think. Because when you make a decision, where does it come from? Do you consciously construct every thought, or do ideas simply appear? Think about the last time you had a sudden realization, or a gut feeling, or an impulse you couldn't fully explain. It felt like it came from somewhere, but where? Neuroscience tells us that many decisions are made by the brain before we become consciously aware of them. Your mind prepares the action and then presents it to you as if you chose it. In a way, your brain is still giving you commands, only now it disguises them as your own thoughts. So what changed in history might not be the presence of these voices, but the way we interpret them. Ancient humans externalized them, we internalized them. But the source, the deep unconscious processes shaping our perception, remains the same. And that raises a question that becomes harder to ignore. If your thoughts are being generated before you're aware of them, if your decisions are being edited before you experience them, then how much of your reality is truly under your control? Because as history moves forward into darker and more chaotic periods, we begin to see something even more disturbing. Entire populations, not just individuals, began to experience realities shaped by fear. They didn't just hear voices, they saw things that weren't there and believed them with absolute certainty. The next chapter takes us into a time when reality itself became unstable, when the human mind, under pressure, began to create worlds filled with demons, witches, and unseen horrors, and no one realized it was all being edited from within. There are moments in history where reality doesn't just bend for an individual, it bends for everyone at once. The Middle Ages was one of those moments. Step into a small European village sometime in the 14th or 15th century. The air is heavy with uncertainty. Disease moves silently. Crops fail without warning. Death is not an abstract idea. It's a constant presence, lingering just outside the door. There is no modern science to explain what's happening. No microscopes, no understanding of bacteria or viruses. Only questions and fear. And the brain, desperate for answers, begins to fill the void. In that world, the unexplained didn't remain unexplained for long. It transformed. A sudden illness wasn't random. It was a curse. A failed harvest wasn't natural. It was punishment. A shadow moving at night wasn't imagination. It was something watching. And slowly, almost invisibly, a new version of reality took shape. One where invisible forces weren't just possible, they were everywhere. Across regions influenced by institutions like the Catholic Church, the unseen world became structured, detailed, and terrifyingly specific. There were angels and demons, heavens and hells, blessings and damnations, all woven into daily life with unquestioned certainty. But this wasn't just belief. People experienced it. They saw demons in the corners of dark rooms. They felt presences standing behind them in the silence of the night. They heard whispers in moments of isolation, not as vague sensations, but as vivid, undeniable encounters. And when enough people share the same expectation, the brain begins to cooperate. It starts to generate experiences that match the narrative, because the human mind is not just a receiver of reality, it's a predictor. It constantly anticipates what should be there, and sometimes it creates it. This is where things begin to spiral. In parts of Europe, whispers turned into accusations turned into fear, and fear, once embedded deeply enough, began to reshape what people saw. The phenomenon we now call witch hunts didn't emerge out of nowhere. They grew from a reality that felt completely logical to those living inside it. In villages across the continent, people became convinced that witches were real, active, and dangerous, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a physical, immediate way. And when they looked at their neighbors, they began to see signs. A glance held too long, a strange habit, an unexplained event. These small details, filtered through a brain primed by fear, became evidence. The chilling part? The accused sometimes believed it too. There are records from trials where individuals confessed to acts they could not have possibly committed, flying, casting spells, communicating with dark forces. These confessions weren't always forced through torture alone. In some cases, they seemed genuine, as if the boundary between imagination and memory had dissolved. As if the brain, overwhelmed by pressure and suggestion, had rewritten reality from the inside. Events like the Salem witch trials are often remembered as isolated hysteria, but they were part of a much larger pattern, a pattern where collective belief didn't just influence thought, it altered perception. Young girls claimed to see invisible attackers. Entire communities accepted these visions as real. The courtroom became a stage where unseen forces were treated as evidence, and the brain, caught in a web of expectation, delivered exactly what the situation demanded. People weren't lying, they were perceiving. And that's what makes it unsettling, because it suggests that under the right conditions, reality itself becomes negotiable. The brain, when surrounded by fear, authority, and shared belief, can begin to construct a world that feels just as solid as the one you trust today. But it wasn't just fear that shaped these realities. Faith played an equally powerful role. In monasteries and sacred spaces, individuals reported visions of divine figures, detailed, emotional, and life-altering encounters. Figures bathed in light, voices filled with meaning, sensations of overwhelming presence. These experiences were documented, revered, and accepted as truth. But from a modern perspective, something else becomes visible. The human brain, when placed in isolation, repetition, and deep emotional focus, can enter states where internal imagery becomes indistinguishable from external reality. The same mechanism that created demons in the dark could create angels in the light. Different interpretations, same source. And yet, for the people living through it, there was no distinction. Their reality was coherent, consistent, shared. Which raises a question that lingers uncomfortably beneath the surface. If thousands, even millions of people can experience something together, does that make it real? Or does it simply make the illusion stronger? Because over time, as these beliefs became institutionalized, they gained power, not just socially, but psychologically. Authority figures reinforced them, rituals repeated them, stories amplified them. And the brain, exposed to the same patterns again and again, began to treat them as undeniable truths. Reality wasn't just edited individually anymore, it was edited collectively. But every system built on perception eventually faces a challenge. As Europe moved closer to the modern age, something began to shift, quietly at first, almost imperceptibly. A few individuals started to question not just the beliefs themselves, but the nature of perception. What if what we see isn't always real? What if the mind can be deceived not by external forces, but by itself? These were dangerous questions, because if perception could be wrong, then everything built upon it, fear, faith, authority, could begin to crack. And once that doubt enters the human mind, it doesn't leave easily. The next chapter takes us into a turning point in history, when thinkers dared to challenge reality itself, and in doing so, uncovered something even more unsettling, that the mind you trust may be the one thing you should question the most.
There comes a point in every long-held illusion when something doesn't quite fit anymore. A detail, a contradiction, a quiet inconsistency that refuses to disappear. For centuries, people had lived inside realities shaped by fear and faith, worlds where demons lurked in shadows and divine voices guided decisions. These perceptions felt solid, unquestionable, almost permanent. But then, slowly, something began to fracture. Not the world itself, but the certainty of how it was perceived. It started with a different kind of courage, not the courage to fight or survive, but the courage to question, to look at everything that had always been accepted as real and ask a dangerous, almost unthinkable question. What if it isn't? In the intellectual circles of Europe, a shift was taking place. Scholars and thinkers began turning their attention inward, toward the mind itself. Instead of asking what the world was made of, they asked something far more unsettling. How do we know anything at all? Among them was René Descartes, a man who would take doubt further than anyone before him. Descartes didn't just question specific beliefs, he questioned everything. The senses, he argued, could deceive. Sight could be fooled by illusions. Sounds could be misheard. Even touch could mislead. If your senses could trick you once, how could you ever fully trust them? But he didn't stop there. He imagined something even more extreme, a possibility so unsettling that it still echoes through philosophy today. What if there were a powerful force, an unseen manipulator controlling everything you perceive, feeding you a perfectly constructed illusion moment by moment, so convincing that you would never realize it wasn't real? You see a world, you feel your body, you think your thoughts. But what if all of it is being generated? Not by reality itself, but by something else. It's a chilling idea,
And yet, once introduced, it's impossible to fully dismiss. Because even now, as you sit here watching, you are relying entirely on your senses and your mind to tell you what's real. And Descartes asked the question no one had dared to ask before. What if those very tools are unreliable? His conclusion was famously simple, yet deeply profound. I think, therefore I am. In a world where everything could be doubted, the one thing that remained certain was the existence of the thinking self. But even that certainty carries a hidden tension. Because if the only thing you can truly trust is your own mind, and your mind is capable of constructing entire realities, then you are trapped inside the very thing you're trying to understand. Around the same time, other thinkers began exploring similar ideas. John Locke proposed that the mind starts as a blank slate, tabula rasa, and that all knowledge comes from experience. But if experience is filtered through perception, then reality itself becomes something shaped, not simply received. Then came George Berkeley, who pushed the idea even further. He argued that objects don't exist independently of perception, that something only exists because it is perceived. In other words, the world isn't something out there waiting to be observed. It is something that comes into being through observation. It sounds abstract, almost philosophical to the point of being impractical. But think about it. Color doesn't exist without eyes to see it. Sound doesn't exist without ears to hear it. Even space and distance rely on perception to have meaning. Strip away the observer, and what remains? The more these thinkers questioned reality, the more unstable it seemed to become. And yet, outside these intellectual circles, life continued as usual. People still trusted their senses, still believed in the solidity of the world around them. But beneath the surface, something had changed. A seed of doubt had been planted. And doubt has a peculiar nature. It doesn't stay contained. Once you begin to question one aspect of reality, it spreads, quietly, persistently, until even the most basic assumptions begin to feel uncertain. This shift didn't just affect philosophy, it began to influence science as well. As the Enlightenment progressed, scientists started relying less on intuition and more on measurement. Instruments were developed to extend human perception, microscopes to see the unseen, telescopes to observe the distant. But these tools revealed something unexpected. Reality, when observed more closely, didn't become clearer. It became stranger. Things behaved in ways that defied common sense. Patterns emerged that contradicted everyday experience. The deeper humans looked, the less reality resembled what it appeared to be on the surface. And once again, the brain was forced to adapt. Because if reality at its core doesn't match what we perceive, then perception itself must be incomplete, or worse, edited. This growing realization created a tension that still exists today. On one side, the intuitive world, the one you see, feel, and trust. On the other, the hidden world revealed by science, strange, counterintuitive, often impossible to fully visualize. Your brain lives between these two layers, and to keep you functioning, it simplifies, it filters, it edits. It gives you a version of reality that is useful, not necessarily accurate. But the Enlightenment didn't fully resolve this tension. It only exposed it. Because as history moved forward into periods of conflict and chaos, something began to happen that would push the human mind to its limits. Situations where perception didn't just become questionable, it began to break. Soldiers on battlefields, survivors of unimaginable trauma, individuals pushed beyond what the brain was designed to handle. In those moments, the editing process didn't just misinterpret reality, it fractured it. And what emerged from those fractures would reveal something deeply unsettling, that under enough pressure, the brain doesn't just misinterpret reality, it can create entirely new ones. The next chapter takes us into those moments where reality shattered under the weight of human experience, and the mind revealed just how fragile the world you trust truly is.
There are places in history where reality doesn't slowly drift out of alignment. It collapses, not gently, not subtly, but all at once under pressure so intense that the human mind, no matter how resilient, begins to fracture. War is one of those places. Stand for a moment in the trenches of World War I. The air is thick with mud and decay. The ground trembles constantly, not from movement, but from impact. Explosions tear through the silence again and again, each one closer than the last. There is no clear beginning or end to the chaos. Day blends into night. Sound becomes a continuous roar. The body is exhausted, but sleep offers no escape, only more noise, more fear, more uncertainty. And slowly, something begins to change. At first, it's subtle. A soldier hears something that isn't there, a voice calling his name through the noise. He turns, but no one is there. He blinks, shakes his head, tries to refocus. But the brain, overwhelmed, has already begun to shift. Because under extreme stress, the mind doesn't process reality the way it normally does. It prioritizes survival over accuracy. It filters aggressively. It predicts threats even when none exist. And sometimes, it creates them. As the days stretch into weeks, soldiers began reporting experiences that feel disturbingly real. Figures moving in the distance that vanish when approached, shadows that seem to follow them, the sensation of being watched even in complete isolation. These aren't exaggerations, they are perceptions. The brain, pushed beyond its limits, begins to blur the line between what is seen and what is feared. And then comes something even more unsettling. Time itself starts to break. Moments stretch unnaturally long during intense danger. Seconds feel like minutes. Every detail sharpens. The sound of a breath, the flicker of movement, the weight of anticipation. But later, when the danger has passed, entire hours seem to disappear. Events become fragmented. Memories lose their sequence. The brain is no longer recording reality as a continuous flow. It's cutting it apart, rearranging it, editing it into something it can survive. This phenomenon, later described as shell shock, wasn't fully understood at the time. Soldiers were often seen as weak, unstable, or broken. But what was really happening was far more complex. Their brains were rewriting reality in real time. And even when the war ended, the editing didn't stop. Many soldiers returned home physically intact, but mentally, something had shifted. Loud noises triggered panic. Familiar places felt foreign. Faces blurred into unfamiliarity. Some reported hearing voices long after the battlefield was gone. Others relived moments of trauma as if they were happening again, vivid, immersive, impossible to distinguish from the present. It was as if their minds had lost the ability to separate memory from reality. And in a way, they had. Because trauma doesn't just leave a mark on memory. It changes how memory works. It alters how the brain prioritizes, processes, and reconstructs experience. And once that system is disrupted, reality itself becomes unstable. But war was not the only place this occurred. In extreme conditions, prison camps, isolation, prolonged fear, the same patterns began to emerge. During World War II, survivors of concentration camps reported experiences that defied normal understanding of perception. Hunger, exhaustion, and constant threat pushed their minds into altered states. Some saw food where there was none. Others felt sensations of warmth in freezing conditions. There were moments where reality seemed to slip, where the environment no longer matched what was physically present. Again, these weren't simple delusions. They were survival mechanisms. The brain, faced with unbearable conditions, began to construct experiences that could sustain the individual, even if those experiences weren't real. And then there are accounts of isolation. Humans are not designed to be alone for extended periods without stimulation.
When deprived of interaction, of variation, of sensory input, the brain begins to compensate. It fills the silence. In polar expeditions, in solitary confinement, in long-term isolation, individuals have reported hearing voices, seeing figures, feeling presences, not faintly, but vividly. The mind, in the absence of external reality, generates its own, and those generated experiences feel just as real as anything else, which leads to an unsettling realization. Reality, as you experience it, is not just shaped by what's out there, but by what your brain needs in order to function. Under normal conditions, the brain aligns closely with the external world. It edits, yes, but within limits that keep you grounded. But under pressure, extreme fear, trauma, isolation, those limits break. And when they do, the brain reveals something it usually keeps hidden: its ability to create entire realities on its own. This isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a fundamental truth about how perception works. Because even in everyday life, your brain is constantly predicting, filtering, and constructing your experience. You don't notice it because the process is stable. But stability is not the same as accuracy, and when that stability is disrupted even slightly, the illusion becomes visible. A shadow that looks like something more, a sound that feels out of place, a memory that shifts without warning, small cracks in the system. But history shows us what happens when those cracks widen. When the brain is pushed far enough, reality doesn't just blur, it breaks. And once it breaks, it doesn't always return to the way it was. As the world moved into the modern era, scientists began to study these phenomena more closely. They wanted to understand not just what was happening, but why. Why does the brain distort reality under pressure? Why does it create experiences that aren't there? And most importantly, if the brain can alter reality so dramatically in extreme conditions, what is it doing in normal ones? Because what they discovered next would be even more unsettling. They found that you don't need war, trauma, or isolation to experience a distorted reality. All it takes is your brain doing what it always does. The next chapter takes us into laboratories, experiments, and controlled environments, where scientists proved something that changes everything. Your brain is not showing you reality. It's showing you a version of it, carefully edited, constantly updated, and never entirely true.
By the time the world began to settle into the rhythms of the modern age, something had shifted in how humans approached truth. For centuries, reality had been shaped by belief, fear, and philosophy. But now a new method emerged: controlled, repeatable, measurable. Science stepped in, not to describe reality as it felt, but to test it. And what it uncovered was deeply unsettling. Because when scientists began isolating perception, pulling it apart piece by piece, they didn't find a stable window into reality. They found a system that could be tricked, easily. One of the earliest demonstrations came from something deceptively simple: optical illusions. At first glance, they seem like harmless curiosities: lines that appear bent, shapes that seem to move, colors that shift depending on their surroundings. But beneath that simplicity lies a profound truth. Your eyes are not cameras. They don't passively capture reality. They send incomplete signals to the brain, and the brain fills in the rest. Take the Mueller-Lyer illusion, where two lines of equal length appear different because of the direction of arrows at their ends. Even when you know the lines are identical, your perception refuses to correct itself. You see the illusion anyway. Not because you're mistaken, but because your brain is prioritizing interpretation over accuracy. It's using shortcuts, rules built from past experience, to construct what it believes is the most likely version of reality. And sometimes those shortcuts are wrong. But the experiments didn't stop with vision. Scientists began to test something even more personal: memory. We tend to think of memory as a recording, a stored version of past events that we can revisit whenever we choose. But experiments revealed something very different. In studies led by Elizabeth Loftus, participants were shown how easily their memories could be altered. By introducing subtle suggestions, researchers were able to make people remember events that never happened. Not vaguely, but in detail. Participants described scenes, emotions, even sensory experiences tied to these false memories, and when asked, they expressed complete confidence in their accuracy. Think about that. Events that never occurred felt real, not because people were lying, but because their brains had constructed those memories as if they were true. Which raises a disturbing possibility. If your memories can be edited, then your past is not fixed. It's flexible. And if your past can change, even slightly, then your identity, built on those memories, becomes unstable as well. But perhaps the most striking experiments came from the study of attention. Because it turns out, your brain doesn't process everything you see. It can't. There's too much information. So it selects, filters, ignores. And sometimes it ignores things so obvious that it feels impossible. In a famous experiment known as inattentional blindness, participants were asked to focus on a simple task, counting the number of times a ball was passed between players. As they concentrated, something unexpected happened. A person in a gorilla suit walked directly through the scene, stopped, looked at the camera, then walked away. And many participants never saw it. Not because it was hidden, not because it was fast, but because their brain had decided it wasn't relevant, so it simply removed it from perception. Let that sink in. Something can be directly in front of you, and you can miss it completely. Not due to distraction, but because your brain edits reality in real time, deciding what deserves your awareness and what doesn't. This isn't a flaw, it's a feature. Without this filtering, you would be overwhelmed, unable to function, lost in a flood of sensory information. So your brain protects you. It simplifies. But in doing so, it creates a version of reality that is incomplete, selective, edited. And then there's something even subtler, something that operates beneath conscious awareness: prediction. Your brain is constantly predicting what will happen next. Based on past experience, it anticipates sights, sounds, and events before they occur. And when reality doesn't match the prediction, the brain adjusts. Not always by correcting the prediction, but sometimes by adjusting perception itself. In other words, your brain can make reality fit its expectations. This explains why two people can witness the same event and walk away with completely different interpretations. Not because one is right and the other is wrong, but because each brain edited the experience differently, filtered it through different expectations, constructed different realities, and believed them equally. As these discoveries accumulated, a new understanding began to form. Reality, as humans experience it, is not a direct reflection of the external world. It is a model, a simulation constructed by the brain, based on sensory input, past experience, and prediction. Accurate enough to navigate, but not necessarily true. And once you begin to see perception this way, something changes. The certainty you once felt starts to fade. Because if your brain is constantly editing, filtering, and predicting, then what you experience is not reality itself. It's your brain's best guess. And like any guess, it can be wrong. But here's where things take an even more unexpected turn. Because up until now, these distortions have been natural, products of the brain's internal processes, unintentional, automatic. But as technology advanced, humans discovered something remarkable. They could begin to influence this process from the outside. Not just study perception, but shape it, control it, even manipulate it. And as the digital age began to take hold, the line between real and constructed reality started to blur in ways no previous generation had ever experienced. Because now, it wasn't just your brain editing reality. It was something else working alongside it. The next chapter takes us into that world, where screens, algorithms, and artificial environments don't just reflect reality, they rewrite it. There was a time when the brain worked alone. Every distortion, every illusion, every edited fragment of reality, it all came from within. The mind filtered the world, shaped it, simplified it, and presented it to you as something stable enough to trust. But that was before something new entered the process, something external, something that didn't just observe how the brain edits reality, but learned how to work with it. And once that happened, the nature of reality itself began to change. Quietly at first, almost invisibly. The arrival of digital technology didn't feel like a disruption. It felt like progress. Screens made life easier. Information became accessible. Communication became instant. But behind that convenience, something deeper was happening. For the first time in human history, there were systems being designed not just to deliver information, but to shape perception. And they were learning fast. Every time you scroll, pause, click, or watch, even for a second, you leave behind a trace, a signal, a piece of data that reveals something about how your brain works, what captures your attention, what you ignore, what you react to. Over time, these systems begin to understand you, not as a person in the emotional sense, but as a pattern of perception. And once they understand the pattern, they can begin to predict it. And once they can predict it, they can begin to guide it. This is where the editing becomes collaborative. Your brain is still filtering reality, but now it's being fed a carefully curated stream of inputs designed to align with its expectations. Not to challenge them, not to expand them, but to reinforce them. And reinforcement feels like truth. Imagine opening a screen and seeing ideas that match your beliefs, images that align with your preferences, narratives that confirm what you already suspect. It feels natural, comfortable, real. But what you don't see are the thousands of other possibilities that were filtered out before they ever reached you. Not by your brain alone, but by something else working in parallel. Something that understands that your perception isn't neutral, it's guided by attention, emotion, and familiarity. And if those elements can be influenced, then reality as you experience it can be shaped. This is no longer theory, it's design. Social platforms, digital media environments, and algorithmic systems don't just show you the world, they construct a version of it tailored specifically to you. Two people living in the same city at the same time can open their devices and experience completely different realities, different events, different priorities, different truths, and both will feel equally convinced that what they're seeing is accurate because their brains are receiving consistent reinforcing inputs. Just like ancient societies built shared realities through belief and repetition, we are now building personalized realities through data and design. But the manipulation doesn't stop at what you see, it extends to how you feel. Content is not neutral, it is optimized, refined, adjusted to trigger emotional responses, curiosity, anger, excitement, fear. Because emotion anchors perception. The stronger the emotional reaction, the more real something feels. And once something feels real, it becomes harder to question. But perhaps the most unsettling development is not in what we consume, it's in what we can no longer distinguish. The rise of artificial imagery, altered videos, and fabricated voices has introduced a new layer to perception, one where seeing is no longer believing. There are now visuals so precise, so convincing that they can replicate reality with near-perfect accuracy. Faces that don't exist, voices that were never spoken, moments that never happened. And yet when presented to the brain, they trigger the same recognition systems as real experiences. Because the brain isn't verifying authenticity, it's matching patterns. If something looks right, sounds right, and behaves as expected, the brain accepts it, at least initially. And in that moment of acceptance, the illusion becomes real, if only for a second. But seconds are enough, because once an idea enters perception, it can linger, it can influence thought, shape memory, alter belief. And by the time doubt arrives, the impression has already been made. This creates a new kind of uncertainty that didn't exist in previous eras. Before, the brain edited reality from within. Now, reality is being edited from both sides. Internally by the mind, externally by systems designed to interact with it. And the boundary between the two is becoming harder to see. But there's something even more subtle happening beneath all of this, something that affects not just what you perceive, but how you perceive yourself. Digital spaces don't just present information, they present identities, curated versions of people, refined, edited, optimized representations of lives. And as you engage with these representations, your brain begins to compare, adjust, and reinterpret your own sense of self, what you think you are, what you believe you should be, what you feel you lack. All of it begins to shift, quietly, gradually, without clear awareness. Because just like external reality, identity itself is constructed. And when the inputs change, the construction changes. So now the editing process extends even further, not just shaping what you see, not just influencing what you believe, but subtly redefining who you think you are. And the most unsettling part, it doesn't feel forced, it feels natural. Because the brain integrates these changes seamlessly, presenting them as your own thoughts, your own preferences, your own conclusions, just like it always has. Which leads us to a final, unavoidable question. If your perception of the world is being filtered, if your understanding of truth is being shaped, if even your sense of self is being quietly adjusted, then what remains that is truly, undeniably yours? Because as we reach the end of this journey, the question is no longer just about reality, it's about identity. The next chapter takes us to the deepest layer of all, where the line between perception and self begins to dissolve, and we are left with one final mystery. If your brain edits everything you experience, then who or what is the one experiencing it?
At the end of every long journey, through history, through fear and faith, through war and science, through illusion and invention, there is always a moment where the story turns inward. Not toward the world, but toward you. Because everything we've uncovered, every distorted perception, every constructed memory, every edited fragment of reality leads to a single, unavoidable question. If your brain is shaping everything you experience, then what exactly is the you experiencing it? It feels like a simple question. You've always known who you are, haven't you? A name, a face, a collection of memories, a continuous sense of being that has followed you from childhood to this very moment. But now, something begins to shift. Because every part of that identity depends on the same system we've been examining. Your memories? They are reconstructed, not replayed. Your perceptions? They are filtered, not direct. Your thoughts? They appear before you're aware of them. And your sense of self, the feeling that there is a stable you at the center of all this, that too may be part of the edit. Consider this. Right now, as you listen, there is a voice in your mind interpreting these words. It feels like you. It feels like your inner self, your conscious awareness. But where does that voice come from? You don't manually construct each sentence in your thoughts. You don't deliberately choose every interpretation. They emerge, effortlessly, continuously, almost as if they're being generated and then presented to you. In the same way ancient humans may have heard voices they believed were external, you hear a voice you believe is internal. But in both cases, the experience is the same. A thought appears, and it feels real. So what if the self is not the creator of these thoughts, but the observer of them? This idea has appeared in different forms across history. In Eastern traditions, philosophers and practitioners explored the concept that the self is not a fixed entity, but a process, a continuous flow of experience without a permanent center. In Western thought, similar questions emerged during moments of deep reflection and doubt.
And in modern neuroscience, something even more intriguing has been observed. When scientists study the brain during decision-making, they find that neural activity often begins before a person becomes consciously aware of their choice. The brain prepares the action, and only afterward does the feeling of, "I decided," appear. It's subtle, almost invisible, but it suggests something profound. The sense of control you feel may not be the origin of your actions. It may be the interpretation of them, which means the you at the center of your experience might not be directing reality, but narrating it, telling a story that makes everything feel coherent, a story that says, "This is happening to me. I am choosing this. I am thinking this." But what if that story is constructed after the fact? What if the brain edits not just your perception of the world, but your perception of yourself? It's an unsettling idea because it challenges something deeply personal, the belief that there is a stable, independent observer inside you, separate from everything else. But as we've seen throughout history, the brain doesn't operate in separate layers. Perception, memory, emotion, identity, they are all intertwined. They rise together, they shift together, they are edited together. And when one changes, the others follow. Which brings us back to the question, if everything you experience is constructed, then what is real? The answer may not be what you expect, because real might not mean accurate. It might mean functional. Your brain doesn't aim to show you the world exactly as it is. It aims to show you a version that allows you to survive, to navigate, to make sense of complexity. A version that is consistent enough to trust, even if it's not complete. And within that version, it creates a self, an identity that feels continuous, meaningful, and in control. Not because it is perfectly true, but because it works. Because without it, the experience of life would fragment, become chaotic, unmanageable. So the edit is not a flaw, it's a necessity. But once you become aware of it, something changes. The certainty you once had begins to soften. You start to notice the gaps, the moments where perception doesn't quite align, the times when memory shifts, the instances where thoughts appear without clear origin, and instead of feeling unsettling, it can become something else, a kind of clarity. Because if your reality is being constructed, then it is not fixed, it is flexible. Which means the way you experience the world, the meaning you assign to events, the identity you carry, the interpretations you make, are not locked in place. They can change. Not instantly, not completely, but gradually as awareness grows. And perhaps that is where the real power lies. Not in escaping the edit, because that may be impossible, but in recognizing it. In understanding that what you see is not the full picture, that what you remember is not the exact past, that what you think is not always under your control, and that the you experiencing all of this is part of the same beautifully complex system. A system that has evolved over thousands of years, from ancient caves to digital screens, from whispered voices to silent thoughts, from shared myths to personalized realities. A system that doesn't just observe the world, but creates it, moment by moment, thought by thought, edit by edit. And now, as the video comes to an end, there is one final thought to leave you with. Not an answer, but a question. If your brain is constantly shaping your reality, filtering it, altering it, telling you what is real and what is not, then the next time you look around, at the world, at others, at yourself, you might pause, just for a moment, and wonder, is this reality exactly as it is, or is it the version my mind has chosen to show me?